tidal wave. A wall of water stretching from horizon to horizon. One of the most powerful forces on Earth. Crossing entire oceans, unleashing appalling destruction. A killer wave. The ultimate destroyer on our raging planet. Millions of tons of foam and debris. A wave that can destroy entire towns. It all begins maybe hundreds, perhaps even thousands of miles away in the deep ocean. Most are caused by underwater earthquakes that violently jolt the sea floor. The whole ocean above is driven up or down with it. Wave after wave races out across the sea. Many waves, each separated by 100 miles or more, and traveling at up to 500 miles per hour. Out here, the crest of each wave may rise only a foot or two above normal. Someone in a boat in deep ocean water would not even feel it as it passed beneath them. But near land, the rising seafloor forces the wave also to rise. It builds, then breaks into a huge surge of water that rushes ashore. The distant line of white water is a tidal wave that was captured on film April 1st, 1946. It came south from Alaska across the Pacific to hit here on the shores of Hawaii, and it brought terrible loss of life. Bunji Fujimoto, then a 16-year-old student, was on the school bus.
As I recall, we were coming off spring vacation, and being April 1st, April 1st being April Fool's Day.
When one of the children shouted, "There's no water in the ocean," the others just called back, "April Fool," and looked the other way. But sometimes that is the way a tidal wave begins. For every peak, there is a trough. If the trough comes first, the sea is sucked out before the wave comes in. It's a classic danger sign, but no one had warned them. So they drove on down to the school right by the sea. The children wondered why the sea was acting strange, and some ran to look. Bunji Fujimoto held back.
As we watched, water started coming back in, and it didn't stop. It just came roaring in, came over the bank and started where a whole bunch of students were and where we were. So what we did was just turn around and ran.
Some of their teachers lived in the cottages on the lower end of the park. The wave went right through them. It picked up the cottages like matchsticks. 24 of his teachers and schoolmates were taken by the sea. The 1946 tidal wave struck most violently in the city of Hilo on the Big Island of Hawaii. This is the tidal wave capital of the world. It has a long history of disaster. A tidal wave is made up of several waves, one after another. It can last for more than an hour. The second wave struck as Robert Chow was on his way to work.
While going to work, some friends came by and yelled at me, "Tidal wave." So I said, "April Fool," mean April 1st. And she insisted that it's real.
He was soon convinced as a flood of water poured up the river. On the railway bridge at the mouth of the river, one of the spans was down. It was swept upstream under the road bridge to land on a rock more than 200 yards away. He drove as far as he could downtown.
most of the stores on the ocean side of Kamehameha Avenue was demolished. And merchandise were all scattered all over the road.
Some parts of downtown Hilo have since been restored. But most of what was once a busy shopping street is now open space.
My wife and I was in the store in the morning, about 7 o'clock, maybe right around there. So we went out to see what's cooking. We saw the big wave, maybe 30, 50 feet high, with some of the buildings on top of the wave. So we really took off. Maybe we ran 100 miles an hour, maybe. You know, we made it.
Everyone was running. Among those just 50 yards ahead of the third wave was Albert Yasuhara.
The third wave is the biggest wave. It took about, 5 minutes before the waves start coming in. And when it hit the shoreline, 15 feet high of a mass of water coming in.
The next truly catastrophic tidal wave came in 1960. It crossed the Pacific from Chile to Japan and struck Hilo as it passed. The suck of water was so powerful as it washed back out to sea that it bent parking meters in half. This open land was once a thriving Japanese community of families that settled in Hilo 60 years before, who'd lived through the 1946 tidal wave and wanted to stay. In 1960, Jun Shigemasa was with her husband and 18-month-old daughter Jeanette when they heard on the radio that a first wave only 1 foot high had passed them by. They knew there would be a series of waves. June anxiously cared for her baby. Her husband watched as the canal by their house ran dry.
I began to hear this roaring noise constantly, and I told him, I hear the wave coming. The tremendous amount of water was beginning to come in, so we went into the back bedroom and we got on our bed, got higher and higher, so we got on our bedpost. And there was just about 1.5 feet of airspace left before we realized that we need to get out of this situation right now. My husband dove underneath and broke open the window, and I went out first. And then he got Jeanette to cover her nose and her mouth, and he explained that Daddy's going to take you under the water, so hold your breath. And she did. She was very obedient, and she did, and she never swallowed a drop of water. And so he dove under the water, through the window, and out of the house.
They climbed this mango tree and survived. The destruction of property was horrific. Hilo would never be the same. 58 people lost their lives here that night. Pacific-wide, the 1960 tidal wave took 2,000 lives. The most exposed part of the Hilo waterfront today is lined with hotels. The 1946 and 1960 tidal waves swept right through here. No one doubts that one day another will follow. So, this building has been designed to withstand a tidal wave strike. The ground floor is primarily for parking. Where there are walls, they are built so that the next tidal wave can punch right through without damaging the building's basic structure. The hotel guests could take refuge in the upper stories, and they call it vertical evacuation.
Talk to you a little.
A tidal wave is a series of waves. The first is rarely the biggest. It might take 30 minutes before an even bigger wave hits. Near Pearl Harbor is the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center. Tsunami is the word most scientists use for a tidal wave.
Okay, looks like the long periods are clipping out over here. I'll give them a call.
Okay.
They monitor earthquakes everywhere in the Pacific to assess whether they might cause a tidal wave.
Hi, this is Pacific Tsunami Warning Center. What do you have up there? Bigger than an 8. Okay. Yeah, we're clipped out on our line.
Their screens display the signs of a big earthquake somewhere near the Aleutian Islands off Alaska.
Thank you.
It could have triggered a tidal wave. The wave might already be heading for Hawaii's beaches. Traveling 2,000 miles at the speed of a jet plane, it would strike here in just 4.5 hours.
Great, thanks a lot. There's the Alaska message.
Okay, I'll be getting the hard copy out to Civil Defense.
Okay, I'll put the voice copy out now.
The Alaskan Tsunami Warning Center is already on full alert. The Hawaiian authorities are next.
This message is for civil defense and the local news media in the state of Hawaii only. An earthquake occurred at 8 a.m. Hawaiian Standard Time.
At Diamond Head, on the other side of Honolulu, the headquarters of Hawaii's Civil Defense Organization is well protected from almost any tidal wave at their control center buried deep inside the crater wall.
Informed as additional information becomes available.
Attention in the EOC. Attention in the EOC. Will the watch team please assemble at the control point?
Al Kang has a tsunami watch on standby every day of the year, around the clock.
Okay, gentlemen, 0805 now. Mark.
Okay, I'm on Annex E of the Emergency Operating Plan checklist. Ed, would you take all blue items, please, down to but not including the call to the governor?
Understand all blue items except for the call to the governor.
Brian, would you take the call to the governor and all green items?
We'll take the call to the governor. All green ups.
Yeah,
Put us.
Alaska.
Hawaii Emergency Operating Center.
They need to issue a warning 3 hours before the strike. It takes that long to evacuate a city the size of Honolulu.
Any thoughts on school closures?
And now a warning point. We keep your advice. Thank you. 0900.
Okay, you get Larry himself?
Yes, I did.
Okay, super.
At this stage throughout Hawaii, the tourists the state depends on are still filling up the beaches. The earthquake was in a region thousands of miles from here that's notorious as a source of tidal waves. The big question now is, has this quake triggered one that's dangerous enough to disrupt both holidays and business throughout the state? A civil defense computer calculates the progress of a huge mass of water spreading across the Pacific. Like ripples on a gigantic pond, a series of waves, each 100 miles long and maybe only 2 feet high, traveling at tremendous speed. In deep water, the waves are still invisible. Civil defense knows a tidal wave may be here in just a few hours, but not how big it might be. It could be just inches high. It could be a monster. But the rules give them no choice. If the risk to the public is there, and there's enough time to evacuate, they must issue an alert. One big problem is that presently, there is no way to detect a tidal wave in the open ocean north of Hawaii. So no one here knows for sure if they are sounding a false alarm.
If we back off the first wave arrival time at 12:24, that would make first siren sounding about 0924. Do you agree?
That's Charlie.
Okay, so we're going to have to back up the conference call about 30 minutes prior to that.
That's Charlie. I rounded off to make it easier for everybody at 0900 for the conference call.
And 9:30 for the actual siren sounding.
That's Charlie.
Okay.
On the first Monday of every month, the sirens sound throughout Hawaii in a practice alert. In a real alert, this is what happens next. The warning crawls across the picture on all television channels.
Got a tsunami warning here. This area along the coastline, okay?
The volunteer Civil Air Patrol is scrambled. At Civil Defense, a screen shows places on high ground where evacuees can go. Schools, public halls. It also shows fire stations and other emergency services. And on all radio channels.
This is the State Emergency Alert System. We interrupt this program to bring you an important message from State Civil Defense.
In Hawaii, the phone book tells you whether your home is at risk. If it is, you follow the signs on the streets outside. A warning must reach every beach, however remote.
This is a tsunami alert. Retreat to higher ground. Tsunami alert. Retreat to higher ground. The tsunami will arrive at 12:30. This is Cat Flight 5163 along the north shore of Oahu. The beaches are clear. But I repeat, the beaches are clear.
At this stage, all the Civil Defense team can do is wait and deal with any crisis in traffic management. This is what happened in the tsunami alert of 1994. On Oahu alone, 100,000 left the coast in less than 3 hours. But when it finally got here, the wave was just 8 inches high. The whole thing was a false alarm. It proved that the evacuation procedures would work, but it cost an estimated $30 million.
What we have to make a decision in is, from the evidence we have, which is meager, can we cancel an event before a emergency manager has to initiate an evacuation?
It was the second false alarm in only 8 years. The danger is that if they have too many, the public may begin to disregard them. Yet as long as there is no way to detect a tidal wave at sea, there will always be false alarms. One possible way of detecting them is a deep-sea pressure monitoring system developed by this team at the Pacific Marine Environmental Lab in Seattle.
That's right. But a test in deep water in sort of real-life conditions.
At the heart of the system is a pressure gauge, which is lowered to the ocean depths.
The most amazing thing about this device is that it's capable, when placed 3 miles deep in the ocean, of measuring a tsunami at about 1 millimeter in height.
The gauge transmits its measurements to a buoy on the surface, which sends the information on by satellite. A computer monitors the data, searching for the unique pattern of a tidal wave. The team is preparing to deploy a line of gauges across the North Pacific.
Yes.
When they're in place, the shores of the Pacific will be just a little safer. Around the world, waves can reach heights of 50 feet. Riding these monsters takes incredible skill and nerves of steel. Surfers dream of finding the ultimate wave. But the ultimate wave is bigger. Far, far bigger. On October 3rd, 1974, there was a quake off Punta Hermosa Beach near Lima, Peru. Felipe Pomar and Pity Block were surfing immediately after and survived to tell an astonishing story.
When I actually got that the earthquake was over and that it wasn't the end of the world, I jokingly said, let's go surfing. And we jumped in the water to go surfing. The next thing I know, there's a very strong current. And I was going backwards in a current that was faster than anything I had ever experienced before in my life. decided that there was a tidal wave coming. It must have been, I figured, the waves could be 200 or 300 feet tall. The ocean was doing things that I had never seen it do before. Whirlpools, a mile out at sea, which is unheard of. There were these chop that were about 8 feet tall. I knew we were in deep trouble, and we were totally at the mercy of this current.
Palmar and his friend were swept a mile out to sea. They realized there was only one way to survive. Catch the wave and surf it.
I caught the wave, started surfing. Immediately thereafter, I had another thought, which was this might be the last wave of your life. So I did continue to surf and do as many turns as I could. And when I was finally close to shore, I focused on the beach for the first time. And what I saw was a large wave pick up a fishing boat, smash it against a cliff, and in a second, the boat was little pieces of wood.
The tidal wave had passed them. By amazing good fortune, it dumped the two surfers on the beach and swept back out.
It was an incredible feeling. I was the happiest man on the face of the earth, just to be standing on the sand right there.
Big tidal waves are rare, but there are other types of waves that behave in a similar way. This is Greenland, August 1995. Perhaps a mile away from the harbor, an iceberg breaks apart. The falling ice sends out a wave, which spreads rapidly across the fjord. The water is deep, and so like a tidal wave, the wave is long and low and barely visible. But when the wave reaches the shallow water of the harbor, it rises up. Imagine this multiplied 100-fold. The scale, power, and danger of a true tidal wave can be awesome. Their destructive power varies. Small tidal waves are surprisingly common, striking somewhere in the world almost every year. Waves that surge inland up to a height of 15 to 20 feet will occur on average every 4 or 5 years. Maybe once in 20 years, somewhere around the world, there'll be a monster, surging up the shore to 100 feet or even more. The larger the wave, the less frequently it will happen. There's even evidence that throughout our planet's history, there have been vast mega-tsunamis, titanic tidal waves that have left their mark halfway up mountains. Indonesia, 1992. A tidal wave struck here with such ferocity that the waves surged over the shoreline to 86 feet above sea level. Such scenes are a rare opportunity for research for Kostas Sinolakis. He's an engineering scientist who studies tidal waves.
We need this for our engineering models, and it is very important when they build this town again, to know how far to put the houses from the sea.
This village was on the sheltered side of the island, so it was a puzzle why it was so strong and did so much damage when it got here.
Bobby Island is a round island. It looks like this. The tsunami came in from the front and wrapped itself around the island. And the backside of the island, right here where the fishing villages were, the height of the wave was twice what it was on the front side of the island.
Where the two parts of the wave crashed together at this side of the island, the water rose to a tremendous height. Then, as it collapsed, it swept across the villages.
And unfortunately, 800 people died.
That tidal wave was in a remote part of Indonesia. But the entire Pacific Rim is potentially at risk. No major tidal wave has hit the west coast of America in the 150 years since settlers began keeping records. But geologists Jody Bourgeois and Mary Ann Reinhardt have found evidence of an older ocean-wide tidal wave in these Washington state mudflats. Buried 3 feet down in the mud, they found a layer of sand just an inch or two thick. It was left here 300 years ago when a tidal wave swept down this coast. Tidal waves have struck this coast before, and it's inevitable that one day they will strike again. On these low-lying regions of the Los Angeles County shoreline, there's no record of any catastrophic tidal waves since the region was settled. But these streets are under threat. Kostas Sinolakis and his team have used the data he gathers from his field trips to calculate scenarios for what might happen if there's an earthquake just offshore. Spreading out from the Santa Catalina fault line, a tidal wave would hit the shore in just 8 minutes. Their mission is to provide hazard maps for Los Angeles, to be printed in telephone directories, just like those in Hawaii. Their data suggests the wave would travel furthest inland around Marina del Rey, north of Los Angeles Airport. But any low point along the shoreline is at risk.
It means that sooner or later, if you live in a place like this, the odds are that the tsunami will hit and will go straight through. And it's best to know about it and be prepared, because that increases your odds of survival.
But even in Japan, where tidal waves strike every few years, the people who are most at risk can forget all too easily and need to be reminded of the dangers. Throughout Japan's 2,000-year history, disaster has struck an average of once in every generation. The tsunami of 1896 was high enough to crash over this pillar of rock and smash its tip off. It began with an earthquake 200 miles out in the Pacific. That wave took just half an hour to reach the coast. Detailed scientific calculations show that ever-changing heights of the tidal wave are at their greatest in harbors and inlets. The victim's plight was reported in a magazine printed 100 years ago. One woman was swept away in her bathtub. Others were sucked out to sea, then washed back into shore. Some were lucky and survived, but many drowned. This woman struggled to pull her children from the wave, but they were ripped from her hands and never seen again. A bonfire was lit by an heroic doctor to attract injured survivors to his care. This tidal wave was called the Great Meiji Tsunami, and 22,072 died. In this temple, there's a shrine listing all the names of those who were known to have died. The almost inconceivable scale of this disaster serves also to warn those living there now that a tsunami could come again from the same place in the ocean to hit this same shoreline. as it has approximately every 50 years throughout Japanese history. Just 37 years later, sweeping wreckage to a height of 95 feet, they named it the Great Showa Tsunami. This time, more than 3,000 were dead or missing, and over 4,000 homes were swept away. In 1960, 8,000 miles away in South America, an earthquake destroyed the city of Concepcion in Chile. It created a different kind of tidal wave, one that lost little of its power as it crossed the whole Pacific Ocean. The wave was still enormous as it smashed through and past Hawaii. Almost halfway around the Earth, it converged again to home in on Japan with horrendous force. It completely destroyed the small town of Ofunatu. Ironically, this ship was called Bringer of Good Fortune. Even today, the streets of Ofunatu carry a grim reminder of the height the water reached. In 1963, this film was shot in the Kuril Islands to the north of Japan as a tidal wave surged in. In 1983, the thin white line barely visible across the horizon was captured on amateur video. Although this was not the biggest tidal wave to hit Japan, it was by far the best documented, by over 70 cameras. It was triggered by a quake in the sea off the western shore of Japan and swept all the way down the coast, surging into inlets and harbors as it passed. It was strong enough to snap a 4-inch thick mooring rope like a thread. Is well protected from the sea, and the tide range is normally only 8 or 10 inches, so all the water rushing in caused something close to panic. The earthquake itself killed only 4 people, but the tidal wave it generated killed 100. Earthquake alarm. This is the first sign that a tidal wave may be coming. Japan's monitoring stations are constantly on watch to pinpoint its origins and to calculate the strength. If the quake is large and under the sea, computers automatically send out a tsunami warning, while experts double-check how big it might be. They agree to call it Big Tsunami, but this whole process takes several minutes. Too long for this tiny island off the coast. On May 12, 1993, an earthquake jolted Okushiri Island in the middle of the night. These scenes were shot by a television camera crew who were themselves fleeing for their lives. The people who lived here knew that such a powerful quake could mean a tidal wave was on its way, and many escaped to higher ground. The quake set the town ablaze as fire spread and electrical and gas supply lines ruptured. But the flames masked a second tragedy. 8 minutes after the quake, the tidal wave struck in the dark. Beneath the blazing roofs, a wave inundated the entire town. The next day, they saw the damage. In some places, the sea had rushed up to a height of over 90 feet. "229 people lost their lives that night. The constant threat of tidal waves has meant that many coastal towns in Japan are rapidly disappearing behind larger and larger barriers of concrete. This is Taro. Here they make a point of displaying to the public just how high the sea rose in the Great Tsunami of 1933, and even higher in 1896. After 2 major tidal waves, Taro got the message and started building protective walls. When people chose to build houses outside the first wall, they built a second to protect them too. And then on the other side of town, a third wall. But even these massive structures may not be enough to shield Taro against a really large wave. So each coastal town now has a tide gauge, which bounces an ultrasonic signal off the water to measure any unusual change of level. The town hall receives immediate warning of any threatening underwater earthquake. And the computer monitors the regular rise and fall of the tide. If signs of a tidal wave are detected, this will help them decide what action they should take. They don't have much time. This is just a drill. In some coastal towns, there are marked pathways, and they rehearse once a year to make sure the townsfolk know what to do. These are all volunteers. Even this warning system gives the residents only minutes to get to a safe place, and hopefully to escape another disaster on the scale of the Meiji 100 years ago. Another tidal wave from that same fault line is already overdue. If Japan and other at-risk areas are to avoid repeating the tragedies of the past, new and better systems must be developed for the future. Tidal waves are a threat not just to the Pacific shoreline. They can strike any coast in the world. This is Montrose, on the east coast of Scotland. 7,000 years ago, this coast suffered a devastating tidal wave. It swept in from the north, crossed the spit of land on which the town now stands, and traveled across a basin several miles inland. On the shores of that basin, archaeologists have unearthed a relic of that ancient catastrophe. It was a layer of sand 8 inches thick. They could tell how old it was by carbon dating the layers of peat above and below the sand. But they found more and more of the sand layer further inland, and all along the northeast coast of Scotland. They thought it might have been caused by a tidal wave, but that seemed unlikely in a region where earthquakes are almost unknown. Until Norwegian scientists made an astonishing discovery: the remains of a vast underwater landslide on the seabed between Scotland and Norway. 7,000 years ago, that mammoth slide sucked a huge mass of water down with it and generated a gigantic tidal wave. It inundated the coasts of Norway, the Shetland Islands, and Iceland, and then surged south, sweeping away the Stone Age tribes living along the coast of Scotland. Scientists now believe it was triggered by an underwater landslide, thousands of times greater than the collapse of Mount St. Helens. There is growing evidence that giant underwater landslides have generated mega tsunamis throughout geological time. Many of them start right here, at the southeastern end of the Hawaiian chain. The islands are volcanic, created by molten rock bursting up from hotspots below the Pacific Ocean floor. But this new rock is structurally weak, and roughly every 100,000 years, a vast chunk of island cracks away. In minutes, billions of tons of rock plummet miles to the deep ocean floor. And sometime in the next few thousand years, it will probably happen again. A huge slice of the east side of the big island of Hawaii is already splitting away, along a fault known as the Great Crack. No one knows just when it will collapse into the ocean, but someday it will. It'll create a tidal wave that could run up 1,000 feet here in Hawaii and cause devastation on the shores of Japan, Australia, and America. There is no way of stopping that catastrophe. And every few million years, an even bigger wave is likely to strike. On the Brazos River in Texas, when a team of geologists investigated an ancient sand layer 3 feet thick, Jody Bourgeois knew she had discovered something truly extraordinary.
This is part of the layer from a giant tsunami deposit that I found in Texas. The tsunami traveled all the way across the Gulf of Mexico, and we can date this layer to about 65 million years ago, which is when the dinosaurs went extinct.
Many scientists attribute the death of the dinosaurs to a meteor impact here in the Gulf of Mexico, at a site that now spans the coastline of the Yucatan Peninsula.
Goes from here to here.
The crater it generated was at least 112 miles across.
Something like that.
Scientists believe that such an impact could have released the energy of 1 billion Hiroshima bombs. It was an impact that changed the history of the world. The meteor struck in a shallow sea, but still created a gigantic tidal wave that washed over the American coast. If in the future there's a similar impact in the middle of the Pacific, waves would run over the Hawaiian Islands up to 1,000 feet. Every home you see here would be engulfed. And around the Pacific Rim, hundreds of millions of lives could be at risk. Fortunately for us, such monster tidal waves are only likely to happen every several million years. But it is certain that smaller, earthquake-generated tidal waves will continue to happen as they do now, every year or two, with bigger ones every 5 or 10 years. In the places where they exist, warning systems are helping to reduce the risk to human life. But the world population continues to grow, and people are always drawn to the ocean. Perhaps the only way to understand the threat is to experience a tidal wave and survive. Felipe Pomar learned a new respect for the ocean.
For many years after that, I had a totally different feeling about the ocean. I didn't even talk to people about it. I would hope to God that I never have a similar experience again.
As time passes without a tidal wave, we become forgetful. It's hard to believe the devastating power our raging planet can unleash. Somewhere, sometime, it will happen again. Crossing entire oceans, invisibly, with appalling speed, rising into an unstoppable, inescapable monster. One day, the tidal wave will return.